All right, well, welcome back, YouTube. Okay, we got head and neck part 2, picking up right where we left off, vertebral artery. Let's go back down to the neck. Here's vertebral artery. It's kind of a off color. I'll use green to kind of highlight it. It's going up the neck right there in the cervical vertebra. It's going to go inside the skull there. So I colored it in green. The vertebral artery is called such because it ascends in the neck through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebra, C6, all the way up to C1. Write that down. Vertebral arteries ascend in the neck through transverse foramen of cervical vertebra C6 to C1, and it enters the skull via foramen magnum. Inner skull via foramen magnum. All right, let's see here. So we're going to go backwards to this picture. Okay, you can see my ink markings from when I drew before. Now we're going to talk about the bottom half. So I'm going to clear my ink markings from before, and we'll talk about the bottom half. We're going to start at the bottom. I'll use green to color our two vertebral arteries after they've entered the skull, right over medulla oblongata there. Okay, so we got two vertebral arteries. They merge to form one basilar artery right on top of the pons. Use blue for that, basilar artery. Okay, one basilar artery that branches off into two posterior cerebral arteries. How about I use orange? So coloring it in orange there on one side and the other side. Okay, so let's know what we have so far. Two in green, two vertebral arteries. They merge to form one basilar artery. Basilar artery branches into two posterior cerebral arteries. Branches into two posterior cerebral arteries. One more to note, off the posterior cerebral, you got these two communicating arteries that are going to communicate with the top half of this circle of Willis. Let's use green again. Posterior communicating artery right there. Posterior communicating artery right there in green again. So note two posterior communicating arteries. Basically, they're communicating with the top half of the circle of Willis. Alright, let's continue on. So, we'll continue on with some veins that drain the brain. Cerebral veins and dural sinuses. A sinus is a vein. Okay, they function like a vein in that they drain the brain, they return blood to right heart. Here's a picture of a model in the room. We call this guy Dura head. You can see the dural septa inside the skull. They basically, well, I'll teach you what they divide, their septum. Here's a model of just the septum. You can see the blue stuff inside are some of the dural sinuses you have to know. Here's a picture in the book. The picture in the book shows you the little inset, what the skull looks like after you remove the skull cap. It's quartered away here. There's brain in, brain out. Empty brain case right there. And you can see some of the dural septa you have to know. One you have to know is called the Falx Cerebri. Let me get rid of those pen markings. Oh, it's not letting me get rid of it. It's okay. I was going to use them anyways. Well, okay. This one in the sagittal plane is the Falx Cerebri. It divides your two cerebral hemispheres. So that's what I'm writing. Falx Cerebri divides two cerebral hemispheres. Well, know the Falx. Okay, you can call it Falx for short. That green line I drew in along the superior border of Falx is the superior sagittal sinus. A much smaller sinus in the inferior edge of the Falx is the inferior sagittal sinus. So note both of those in the Falx. Superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus. Both are in the Falx. So let's move on. Okay, the next one is the Tentorium Cerebelli. Tentorium Cerebelli. And I already have my green line in there, but this is the partition. The Tentorium Cerebelli is like a tent. It forms a partition between cerebrum above, cerebellum below. So let's note that, the tentorium. So you can just call it tentorium if you want. Its full name is Tentorium Cerebelli. So that septum divides cerebrum from cerebellum. Now where I have my green marking, the posterior edge of the tentorium, you have a sinus called the transverse sinus. Okay? So look for transverse sinus in its posterior edge. Another way you can study the sinuses, you can either study them in the septum or just on the brain. Okay? So it's kind of like zoom in on this. A little bit there. Okay, so what we got here, I'll use green, and in the sagittal plane, you have the superior sagittal sinus. That's the superior sagittal sinus. Let me just write it here. And you have the inferior sagittal sinus. I'll use a different color. Right around, oops, right around here. Okay, in blue, inferior sagittal sinus. So a little vein right here. It's the great cerebral vein. That's on your study guide. Let's note it. I'll use a red right there. Look for great cerebral vein. That's merging with inferior sagittal sinus to form this straight sinus. Use orange. In orange, straight sinus. So all of those are merging superior straight right there. I'll point to it with a black arrow. The confluence of sinuses, where the black arrow is pointing. Confluence of sinuses, where the black arrow is pointing. There's a couple others, but you can't see from this point of view, so we'll move on. Let's look at a posterior view. The posterior view, here again, we can see right where I'm pointing, confluence of sinuses. And then coming out from that are the transverse sinuses, which we've already noted. Now, the transverse sinus will continue on as the sigmoid sinus, okay, right there. So let's look at this view here. Confluence of sinuses, transverse sinus, or it's an S shape. That's the sigmoid sinus. So let's add that to the list. I'll highlight it in green here. The S shape sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus continues on as the internal jugular vein as it exits the skull through the jugular foramen. There's a light blue color. So when I'm coloring it light blue, think of this as exiting the skull and becoming the internal jugular vein. That's the vein that runs with the carotid artery. So notice that the two major artery and vein of the neck, the common carotid artery and the internal jugular, they don't have the same name. A lot of time arteries and veins have the same name, like brachial artery and vein. But in the neck, it's common carotid artery and internal jugular vein that run together. Okay, so let me write that down. Sigmoid sinus continues on as internal jugular vein. sigmoid sinus continues on as the internal jugular vein. Okay, it exits the skull at the foramen, jugular foramen. Exits skull via jugular foramen. So just note that. And the other thing I mentioned, the internal jugular vein, it runs with the carotid arteries. IJV for short, internal jugular vein, runs with carotid arteries. There's a picture in the book you can study. It's labeled. It's a nice perspective. There's a model in the room you can study. There are other veins in the neck besides the IJV. There's also anterior jugular and external jugular veins. Okay, so IJV is one. There's two others. So, two other veins of the neck. External jugular vein. Anterior jugular vein. I'll highlight them in green. There's the one anterior jugular there, and there's the external jugular there. Highlight it in green on both pictures. So don't confuse internal and external jugular. That's a common mistake. Notice that part of the external jugular is on top of the SCM, the sternocleidomastoid neck muscle. In this picture here, this picture is a good one to look at. It has a dissection of the internal jugular vein with the common carotid artery. I'll highlight the internal jugular vein in green. And I'll use the external jugular as a different color. How about this light blue? So again, the external jugular vein on top of sternocleidomastoid, not to be confused with the internal jugular vein, deeper. So a part of EJV is on top of sternocleidomastoid. The rest of these slides aren't meant for teaching. I just want you to know when you're in the lab and you're studying the models, which ones to get, the heart and all the blood vessel ones. Okay, I'll fly through it real fast. You have access to these slides on Canvas. I'll use any or all of these. Okay, this is like, I got something from CRC. They have a virtual anatomy lab, and I thought I'd just give it to you. It has labels on, labels off. Those are for your personal study, not for presentation here today. Well, anyways, you have access to all of these slides, and you can take a look at them yourself. I presented everything you need to know that will get you ready for the practical and for the lecture exam for blood vessels. All right, let's take another break. And we'll come back with blood vessels of upper limb, lower limb. Look for those.